Welcome to the Clean Water Service Provider Target Setting Primer. The subject matter covered in this training video is specific to the Lake Champlain and Memphremagog Total Maximum Daily Load Plans, from this point forward referred to as TMDLs. This training video is presented by the State of Vermont Water Investment Division by the Watershed Planning Program Manager, Ethan Swift, Watershed Planning Supervisor, Ben Kopans, and me, Danielle Ozarski, Watershed Planner. During this video, you will learn about the total maximum daily load plans, the 3 different phases of the TMDL implementation plans, how non-regulatory phosphorus reduction targets are determined along with the funding to achieve them, and the regulatory and non-regulatory actions needed to meet the Phase 3 phosphorus reduction targets. You may be thinking, what's the difference between regulatory and non-regulatory reductions? Well, regulatory reductions are required by state programs and permitting, and non-regulatory reductions will be achieved by clean water service providers and are voluntary actions. At the end of this presentation, there will be a wrap-up, which includes instructions to access a survey link for your feedback on the training video and suggestions for additional training videos. The survey will also be used to develop a frequently asked questions document that will be posted on our website. Take it away, Ben and Ethan.
Hello, my name is Ethan Swift. I'm the Watershed Planning Program Manager within the Water Investment Division of Vermont DEC. For these next few slides, I will be providing an overview of the Lake Champlain Phosphorus TMDL, that is the what, why, when, and how of the pollution budget and restoration strategy for Lake Champlain. Note that these basics are also applicable to the Lake Memphremagog Phosphorus TMDL. The video in this slide describes what a TMDL, or a total maximum daily load, is for an impaired water body such as for Lake Champlain, and the specific goals and related actions needed to reach those pollution reduction targets for each of the lake segments. In the video, a TMDL is described as the pollution budget for which we set pollution reduction targets for TMDL land use sectors to achieve the pollution budget. Watch the video at your convenience for a little more insight on the TMDL development process. Although this video references the Lake Champlain Phosphorus TMDL, this description may apply to how other TMDLs have been developed across the state. The definition of a TMDL is the total maximum daily load, or the maximum amount of pollution that a water body may receive without exceeding Vermont's water quality standards, herein referred to as a pollution budget. The TMDL loading, or base load, is the current amount of pollution, in this case phosphorus is the limiting nutrient, that flows into a water body, such as Lake Champlain or Lake Memphremagog, from each of the major land use sectors, such as agriculture, developed lands, forested lands, and so forth. An example of this, the annual phosphorus loading into Missisquoi Bay from the watershed area is required to be reduced by 66%, or approximately 100 metric tons per year for all sectors in order to meet the TMDL load reduction targets by 2036. The primary reason for these TMDLs for both Lake Champlain and Lake Memphremagog is because of excess phosphorus entering into our waterways, which affects water quality. Phosphorus is the most limiting nutrient for freshwater systems, which in turn fosters algae growth. An analogy is in baking a batch of cookies, where the ratio of ingredients determines the quality of the cookie. For instance, if the recipe calls for 1 teaspoon of baking powder and instead we add 1 tablespoon, then the outcome of that ratio will result in a much different cookie than what the recipe called for. Harmful algal blooms, or HABs, represent a threat to human health and the environment. Concerns for public safety and the enjoyment of water-based recreation is the fundamental reason why we need to set pollution reduction targets that are intended to mitigate the social and economic impacts to these values over time. Watch the linked video on this slide at your convenience to learn more about harmful algal blooms. The Lake Champlain and Memphremagog TMDLs have each been established over a 20-year timeframe in order to meet their respective pollution reduction targets. Here's a timeline that shows notable events that demonstrate the state's commitment in meeting both TMDL target reductions over that 20-year timeframe. In 2015, Vermont's legislature passed the state's Clean Water Act, or Act 64. Then the revised Lake Champlain Phosphorus TMDL Phase 1 plan was approved by EPA in 2016, and subsequent tactical basin plans have been developed that represent the TMDL Phase 2 implementation plans. Recently, in 2019, with the passage of the Clean Water Service Delivery Act, also known as Act 76, the state has established a framework to achieve the load allocation side of the TMDL, or the non-regulatory actions that are identified in tactical basin plans. Also known as the Phase 3 content, these next iteration of tactical basin plans are being developed in order to refine pollution reduction targets to achieve the remaining pollution budget established by the Phase 1 plan of 2016. In a parallel effort, a pollution budget was developed in 2017 for the Lake Memphremagog phosphorus TMDL, for which a 20-year timeline establishes target reductions and also to be achieved through a combination of regulatory programs and non-regulatory project implementation. Now, to recap the what, why, when, and how of the Lake Champlain phosphorus TMDL, it was first through the passage of Vermont's Clean Water Act, or Act 64, that established the state's programmatic commitments to meet the waste load allocation side of the TMDL, which are the regulatory actions needed to achieve the majority of target reductions. Then, through iterative phases of tactical basin plans, and now combined with the Clean Water Service Delivery Framework, the state has established this framework to achieve the non-regulatory actions that are needed to meet the load allocation side of the TMDL. Clean water project funding is at the heart of this framework, and both regulatory and non-regulatory projects are eligible to receive state and federal funding and technical assistance to help facilitate implementation efforts. As I had mentioned before, the Lake Champlain Phosphorus TMDL incorporates an accountability framework to ensure that phosphorus reduction actions are implemented at a sufficient pace to meet the TMDL requirements, with an estimate of the phosphorus reduction needed as projected within each tactical basin plan on a 5-year rotating basis. The accountability framework calls out each of the 3 phases of TMDL implementation that have been established and are now underway in conformance with this timeline, and in order to show progress towards meeting clean water goals associated with the Lake Champlain TMDL and the Memphremagog TMDL. For the next 3 slides, I will provide a little more background on each of the 3 phases. It was the passage of the TMDL Phase 1 plan in 2016 that established the state's programmatic commitments needed to achieve the regulatory target reductions related to specific TMDL sectors and their related land use activities. The Phase 1 plan also set forth a timeline to achieve clean water goals via the TMDL accountability framework. This is also known as setting reasonable assurances in order to meet required regulatory reductions. The Phase 1 plan established policy commitments to expand and/or refine existing regulations for the agricultural sector, the developed lands or stormwater sector, which includes road networks, wastewater facilities, the forestry sector, and other natural resource sectors such as for wetlands, floodplains, lakeshore, etc. The commitments presented in the Phase 1 plan include new and enhanced regulations, funding and financial incentives, and technical assistance, and builds on the efforts by the state over the past 10 years to reduce phosphorus contributions to the lake. They will require new and increased efforts from nearly every sector of society, including state government, municipalities, farmers, developers, businesses, and landowners. through the end of 2017, the major focus was putting into place the regulatory changes or new programs identified in the Phase 1 implementation plan that provide the platform for longer-term success, along with the resources needed to accomplish that. For Phase 2, it is the TMDL accountability framework which establishes priority milestones contained in each of the 6 Champlain Major River Basin Tactical Basin Plans. In the accountability framework, Tactical Basin Plans are identified as the Phase 2 mechanism to establish the TMDLs, each of which sets forth geographically targeted actions by sector on a 5-year iterative cycle concurrent with each Tactical Basin Plan update process. Those actions and dates constitute the report card elements for that basin. Both an interim and final report card is presented along each 5-year basin planning cycle with a formal assessment of the progress that's made at the end of that Tactical Basin Planning 5-year cycle. The Lake Champlain TMDL is being implemented through a combination of regulatory and non-regulatory programs. Identifying non-regulatory projects often requires an initial assessment phase to identify what BMPs already exist on the landscape and where others might be needed. The Phase 2 content examined how these phosphorus reductions will be met across all land use sectors within each major river basin. The TMDL Phase 3 content within each of the Tactical Basin Plans describes the progress achieved in pollution reductions, and in the case of the Missisquoi and Lamoille Tactical Basin Plans that were just developed in 2021, this reports on the progress achieved since 2016 by each of the TMDL sectors. These Tactical Basin Plans also include the sector-specific target reductions for the next 5-year cycle of that Tactical Basin Plan, so going out now until 2027. The Tactical Basin Plan Phase 3 content reports on reduction requirements across all sectors within each of the 6 Champlain basins and Memphremagog, including regulatory and non-regulatory actions, and identifies gaps in strategy implementation. This Phase 3 project tracking and accounting effort fulfills requirements of the Lake Champlain TMDL accountability framework. Now we are going to transition over to how we set clean water service provider targets and corresponding funding levels. I will let my colleague Ben Copans introduce himself and lead us through this overview.
Thanks, Ethan. I'm Ben Copans, Watershed Planning Supervisor and Watershed Planner for the Upper Connecticut, Passumpsic, and Memphremagog Basins. I'm going to walk through the key steps in setting clean water service provider phosphorus reduction targets and funding levels. The first step is to estimate the regulatory phosphorus reductions for the agricultural, stream, forest, and developed land sectors, and to subtract this from the TMDL phosphorus reduction targets to calculate non-regulatory phosphorus reductions for clean water service providers. We then multiply the clean water service provider phosphorus load reduction targets by sector costing rates to get the total clean water service provider costs. And finally, we adjust the targets and funding levels as necessary to align with the available funding and capacity for project implementation. Now I'm going to walk through each of these steps in greater detail. Regulatory reduction estimates are different for each sector, and in some sectors these vary between basins as well, which impacts the non-regulatory reductions that will be part of clean water service provider targets. The Lake Champlain and Lake Memphremagog TMDLs break the primary sources of phosphorus loading down across the watersheds into agricultural, stream, forest, developed lands, and wastewater treatment facility loading sectors. The phosphorus loading from agricultural lands, forest lands, and developed land sectors are based on the land use generating the phosphorus loading. On the other hand, the stream sector includes phosphorus loading that is generated within the stream channel or through bank erosion, which may be caused by activities across the other 3 sectors, or direct intervention in rivers, which frequently increase the level of stream adjustments and associated phosphorus loading. Finally, wastewater treatment facility loading is not included as part of clean water service provider targets, as this is entirely regulatory in nature. It is important to note that while we need to attribute clean water service provider phosphorus load reduction targets to individual sectors to estimate costs, clean water service providers will have the flexibility during the initial implementation phase to achieve phosphorus load reductions across sectors and will not be held to sector-specific reduction targets. Agricultural regulatory reductions for field areas, as opposed to the farmstead area that's made up of the barn, manure pits, and associated structures, are defined in a legislative report as 90% of the agricultural phosphorus reduction targets for these lands, which leaves 10% of the reduction targets for clean water service providers. Clean water service providers will be implementing the natural resource restoration projects on farms of all sizes, as well as other agricultural practices on non-RAP farms, generally described as farms with less than 4 cows. With the stream sector, we have the highest level of uncertainty around the regulatory reductions that may be achieved through the implementation of statewide regulatory programs or through local river corridor protection bylaws. Our preliminary estimate is that 2/3 of the TMDL stream load reductions will be achieved through the regulatory programs, and so 1/3 of the loading was provided as part of clean water service provider targets. This funding will support the implementation of practices such as river corridor easements, riparian buffer plantings, and stream restoration projects, which together with regulatory programs will help to restore the equilibrium condition of rivers, which is the least erosive condition. The regulatory reductions for streams will be revised as we learn more from the Functioning Floodplains Initiative that will allow us to better estimate load reduction potential of stream regulatory programs in the future. Forest lands are the one sector where phosphorus reduction targets differ substantially between basins. All clean water service provider basins, except for the Missisquoi and South Lake Champlain basins, have reduction targets of 5% of forest land loading, which is expected to be achieved through the implementation of acceptable management practices for forestry. However, South Lake has a reduction target of 40%, and the Missisquoi Basin has a reduction target of 50% of forest land loading, and all but 5% of these loading reductions will be provided to clean water service provider. This means that 88% of the South Lake Basin and 90% of the Missisquoi Basin forest land load reduction targets will be provided to clean water service providers for these basins. For the developed lands sector, regulatory reductions were estimated for the implementation of 4 permit programs, which are each expected to reduce phosphorus loading from a portion of developed lands for each basin. These permit programs include the Municipal Roads General Permit that requires phosphorus reductions from municipal roads, the so-called 3-acre permit that requires phosphorus reductions from parcels with more than 3 acres of impervious surface that were built before the current stormwater standards were in place, the TS4 permit that requires phosphorus reductions from state transportation infrastructure, and the MS4 permit that requires phosphorus reductions from larger municipalities. These regulatory reductions were totaled by basin and subtracted from the phosphorus reduction targets for developed lands to calculate the load reduction targets for clean water service providers. There are several factors that may increase the regulatory reductions and reduce the clean water service provider targets for developed lands in the future. These include the fact that at the time that these estimates were developed, 18% of road segments had not been assessed, as well as a discrepancy between the Municipal Road General Permit phosphorus reduction estimates from the TMDL phosphorus reduction estimates based on tracking and accounting methodologies that use different land use areas. For the state fiscal year 2023 Clean Water Service Provider targets, we have left the load reduction for developed lands based on the current tracking as a conservative assumption, but the Clean Water Service Provider targets are likely to be reduced as these are refined based on more in-depth analysis in the future. The next step in this process is to multiply the reduction targets for each sector for each basin times the sector costing rates to estimate the funding needed. We calculate these sector costing rates by averaging the cost per kilogram for project categories for each sector. This slide shows an example of how we estimate stream sector costs by averaging the cost for floodplain stream restoration projects, river corridor easements, riparian buffer restoration projects, which have an average cost of about $11,000 per kilogram of phosphorus. Similarly, for developed lands, we average stormwater best management practices, road best management practices, riparian buffer restoration, lake shoreland runoff treatment, and lake shoreline restoration, which together have an average cost of nearly $16,000 per kilogram. For farmlands, we averaged the cost for riparian buffer restoration and lake shoreline restoration for an average cost of $7,000 per kilogram of phosphorus. For the forest sector, we only have one project category of forest road best management practices with an estimated cost of $10,000 per kilogram. We expect to expand the project categories in future years for several of these sectors and to see adjustments in the cost per kilogram for projects as formula grant funded projects begin to be implemented, which will adjust the average cost per kilogram in the future for each sector. The total dollars needed to meet non-regulatory reduction targets exceeds the dollars available for the formula grants, so the targets and funding have been scaled to the available funding and capacity for project implementation. In constructing the clean water budget and considering the need to ramp up capacity this first year, the Clean Water Board approved a $7 million investment for formula grants in state fiscal year 2023. A major increase in non-regulatory project support. To allocate this funding across different basins, we propose setting a minimum funding level of $650,000 per basin to support a funding level that sustains implementation by partners and clean water service providers. We then scale the clean water service provider targets across all the sectors based on the $7 million in available funding for state fiscal year 2023. There are several areas that have added to the need to scale back targets, including that we haven't been able to account for other non-regulatory reductions, ongoing uncertainty in the regulatory stream and developed land reduction, and uncertainty around the cost for implementing projects where we expect that clean water service providers will be able to fund higher impact projects due to the incentives in Act 76. There are a lot of assumptions that were necessary for the initial state fiscal year 2023 budget exercise. That means that we will benefit from taking an adaptive management approach for target setting so we can incorporate better information as this becomes available and refine targets for each of the next several years. As clean water service providers begin implementing projects under the formula grants, we will get a better sense of opportunities across different sectors, and we will refine the cost per kilogram for different project types, which will adjust the targets and funding levels in future years. Every 5 years, we will update the tactical basin plan for each basin where we can take a deeper dive for the specific basin to update assumptions around sector-specific targets and priorities, which will have implications for costs. The Basin Water Quality Council, project implementers, state technical staff, and stakeholders in phosphorus reduction efforts collaborate in the planning process to ensure that the Tactical Basin Plan accurately reflects a broad understanding of the priorities for implementing phosphorus reduction projects over the next 5 years.
Thank you for viewing our training video, Clean Water Service Provider Target Setting Primer. We hope you learned the basics about the topics that were presented. Now you should know about TMDLs, as related to Lake Champlain and Lake Memphremagog, the 3 different phases of the TMDL implementation plans, how non-regulatory phosphorus reduction targets are set, along with the funding to achieve them, and the regulatory and non-regulatory actions needed to meet the Phase 3 phosphorus reduction targets. As part of this training, we're asking you to fill out our survey by May 1st, 2022, provide your feedback on the presentation, and get your recommendations for additional training videos. Please use the photo or QR code scanning function on your phone to access the survey link or access the link in the video description. Your feedback will help us to improve our training videos. We would also like to develop an FAQ document based on questions about the video subject matter. Please be sure to include your question in the survey. After May 1st, we will use your questions to produce the FAQ and post them on our website. Thank you for attending this training.